Park rangers always give you the same advice when you check in for a solo backcountry permit. Stick to the marked trails, hang your food away from bears, and always carry a whistle. They tell you these rules to protect you from nature, but what they won't tell you, what they can't admit, is that sometimes nature isn't the thing you need protection from. If you're miles away from the nearest road, shivering in your tent, and you hear someone calling your name out in the pitch-black woods, do not answer. And whatever you do not shine your flashlight into the trees. It was late September, and I was spending a 4-day weekend backpacking through a dense, unmapped section of the San Juan National Forest. I'm an experienced camper, and I specifically chose this spot because it was a brutal 6-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. I wanted absolute silence. No cell service, no tourists, just me and the mountains. By 6 p.m., I had set up my orange, one-man tent in a small clearing surrounded by massive, towering pines. The sun dipped below the peaks, casting long, jagged shadows across the camp. I built a small, controlled fire, ate my freeze-dried dinner, and just sat there, enjoying the crisp mountain air. But as the darkness fully took over, the forest changed. The crickets completely stopped chirping. The wind died down to a dead, suffocating calm. It was that total, unnatural silence that makes your ears ring. I felt a sudden, heavy pressure in my chest, that primal instinct that tells you your eyes aren't the only things looking around. I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire with dirt, crawled into my sleeping bag, and zipped the tent flap shut. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the nylon roof, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Then, around 1:15 a.m., I heard the first footstep. Snap. It was the distinct sound of a heavy branch breaking about 30 feet behind my tent. I froze, my muscles locking up. In the backcountry, you expect to hear animals, the casual foraging of a deer, the heavy scuffling of a bear. But this sound didn't repeat immediately. It was patient. 5 minutes passed in absolute silence. Then, another step. Crunch. Closer this time, right on the edge of my clearing. Whatever was out there was moving on 2 legs. It had a heavy, deliberate stride, but it was pausing between every single step, as if trying to minimize its sound. I reached to my right and quietly wrapped my fingers around the grip of my bear spray. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs, I was terrified the creature would hear it. Suddenly, a voice cut through the dark. It was faint, muffled, and coming from the tree line. "Hey, is anyone out there? I'm lost. I need help." A wave of relief washed over me for a split second. A lost hiker. But before I could unzip the tent to answer, a cold chill struck my spine. The voice sounded off. It was perfectly flat, completely devoid of any real panic or exhaustion. It sounded like someone reading words off a script. And then, it repeated the exact same phrase, with the exact same robotic inflection, 5 feet closer. "Hey, is anyone out there? I'm lost. I need help." I held my breath, gripping the bear spray until my knuckles turned white. I didn't say a word. I knew with absolute certainty that if I spoke, I would be letting whatever that was know exactly where I was sleeping. The footsteps started again, but they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They were circling my tent. Step, step, step. Through the thin orange fabric of my tent wall, illuminated by the faint moonlight, I saw a shadow block out the stars. A massive silhouette stopped right in front of my tent door. It was tall, abnormally thin, and its posture was completely hunched over. It stood there for a full 2 minutes, just inches away from me, separated only by a millimeter of nylon. Then I heard it breathe. It let out a long, wet, rattling wheeze that smelled faintly of rotting meat, the foul odor seeping right through the tent mesh. Slowly, a long, dark shape pressed against the outside of the tent wall. It was a hand. But the fingers were impossibly long, the joints bending at jagged angles as it dragged its nails down the fabric. Screech! Screech! Then the voice started again. But it wasn't asking for help anymore. It was mimicking my own breathing. Every time I inhaled, the shadow outside let out a mocking, wet inhale. Every time I exhaled, it did the same. It was playing with me. The psychological torture was too much. In a blind panic, I raised my bear spray, aimed it directly at the front zipper, and squeezed the trigger. The thick, orange cloud of pepper spray blasted through the mesh door. A horrific, gurgling shriek tore through the clearing. It didn't sound human, and it didn't sound like an animal. It was a high-pitched, metallic wail that vibrated right through the ground. The shadow violently ripped away from the tent, crashing blindly through the bushes and tearing down saplings as it sprinted back into the deep woods. I didn't hesitate. I threw open the ruined tent door, coughing from the residual overspray, and sprinted into the night. I left my backpack, my sleeping bag, and all my gear behind. I didn't care. I ran down the mountain trail in total darkness, navigating purely by memory and the tiny beam of my headlamp, falling over rocks and scraping my arms on branches. I didn't stop running for 4 straight hours until the sun began to rise and I hit the gravel parking lot of the trailhead. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. When I told the ranger what happened, his face went completely pale, but he didn't look surprised. He told me they would send a team to recover my gear, but advised me to go home and forget about the trail. 2 days later, my backpack was shipped to my house in a cardboard box. Inside was a typed note from the forestry office stating my gear had been found scattered across the clearing. But when I pulled my orange tent out of the box, I noticed something they hadn't mentioned. On the back wall of the tent, right where my head had been resting while I lay in my sleeping bag, were 3 deep, perfectly straight cuts sliced completely through the heavy fabric. Like someone had been standing behind me the entire night, waiting for me to fall asleep. There's a reason military and tactical gear uses red lenses on flashlights. Red light doesn't ruin your night vision, and from a distance, it doesn't bleed into the darkness the way a bright white LED does. It keeps you hidden. But if you're camping alone in the high desert of Nevada, miles away from the grid, and you see a faint, rhythmic red light blinking at you from the top of a distant ridge, it doesn't mean someone is lost. It means they've already found you. I do a lot of solo astrophotography. To get the cleanest shots of the Milky Way, you have to go where the light pollution is completely zero. That's how I ended up pitching my tent in a remote canyon valley deep within the Nevada desert, miles down an old, washed-out BLM road. It was a beautiful night. The sky was a canopy of brilliant stars, and my camera was locked onto a tripod 50 feet from my tent, running an automated 2-hour exposure sequence. Around midnight, I was sitting on a folding chair next to my tent, drinking coffee from a thermos. I decided to pull out my binoculars to look up at the ridge line that bordered the eastern side of the canyon. The ridge was a steep, rocky cliff face that rose about 400 feet above my campsite. As I scanned the dark rocks, my heart skipped a beat. Near the very top of the peak, a faint red light flickered on. It stayed on for exactly 3 seconds, then turned off. Then it blinked twice more. Blink, blink. I lowered the binoculars, rubbing my eyes. I raised them again. The light was gone. I figured it was just another photographer, or maybe a border patrol agent tracking a route. But the sheer isolation of the area made me uneasy. I decided to pack up my gear early, pull my camera inside, and head into the tent to sleep it off. By 2 a.m., I was lying inside my tent, listening to the gentle wind scrape sand against the rainfly. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard a faint, high-pitched electronic tone. Beep. It was the specific sound my camera makes when the battery dies or a sequence is manually stopped. But my camera was sitting right inside the tent vestibule with me. I crawled forward and peeked through the clear plastic window of the tent door. My camera was untouched. But out in the middle of the dark clearing, right where my tripod had been standing an hour ago, a faint red glow was illuminating the dirt. Someone was standing out there. They were holding a heavy tactical flashlight with a red filter lens, pointing it directly down at the ground where my footprints were. The red light cast long, demonic shadows across the desert floor. The person was completely covered in dark clothing, a heavy tactical jacket, combat boots, and a full face mask. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a lost hiker. They had hiked down a 400-foot cliff face in total darkness, silently entered my camp, and were now tracking my movements. The figure slowly raised the flashlight. The red beam washed over the front of my tent, turning the thin fabric into a sickening, blood-red glow. I fell backward onto my hands, moving as silently as possible into the back corner of the tent. Through the fabric, I could see the red beam bouncing around, scanning the perimeter. Step. Step. The heavy crunch of combat boots on gravel came right up to the side of my tent. The figure stopped. I could hear them dragging something heavy across the dirt outside. It sounded like metal. A cold realization hit me. They had gone to my truck, found the tire iron I kept in the bed, and were dragging it along the ground. Scrape. Scrape. Suddenly, the red light went out. The darkness was deafening. Then, a voice spoke from right outside the nylon wall, just inches from my face. It was low, raspy, and incredibly calm. I know you're awake in there. I watched you through my scope for 2 hours. You take beautiful pictures. A horrific panic seized my throat. They had an open scope on me from the ridgeline. I reached into my pocket, my trembling fingers finding the keys to my truck. If I could just hit the panic button, the alarm might scare them off, or give me enough time to break out of the tent and run. I slammed my thumb down on the red panic button. Outside, my truck's horn began to blare violently, the headlights flashing and illuminating the entire canyon in bright white bursts. The figure outside reacted instantly, letting out a furious grunt and swinging the heavy iron bar down onto the tent. Crunch! The fiberglass tent poles snapped over my head, collapsing the heavy wet fabric right onto my body. I was trapped under the collapsed nylon, struggling to breathe as the figure began violently stomping on the pile, trying to pin me down. I kicked and thrashed with everything I had, managing to slide my body out through the torn side seam of the tent. I scrambled to my feet in the flashing light of my truck's headlights. The Stalker was standing over my ruined tent, turning to look at me, the iron bar raised high. I didn't try to fight. I sprinted straight to the driver's side door of my truck, ripped it open, threw myself inside, and slammed the lock button. A split second later, the heavy iron bar slammed against the driver's side window. Bang! The heavy glass shattered into a million spider webs, but it held. I turned the key, rammed the truck into drive, and floored the gas pedal. The tires dug into the sand, kicking up a massive cloud as I roared down the unlit BLM road, leaving the flashing lights and the masked figure behind in the desert dust. I drove 3 hours straight until I reached a state police barracks. The deputies went out to the site the next day to investigate. They found my collapsed tent and my broken camera equipment. But on the rocky ridgeline above, right where the red light had first blinked, they found something else. A neat, professional sniper nest set up with a folding chair, an empty box of high-caliber ammunition, and a small, red, tactical flashlight sitting on a rock. And carved deeply into the stone next to the chair was my camera's exact model number and the phrase, "See you soon." Fitness trackers and smartwatches are great for solo camping. They track your heart rate, map your coordinates, and let your family know you're safe via satellite. It gives you a false sense of security. But smart devices are only as smart as the data they collect. And if you're sleeping alone in a hammock deep in the Appalachian Mountains and your watch suddenly vibrates at 3 a.m. to warn you that your Bluetooth sync has detected a second heartbeat within 2 feet of your wrist, you'll realize that technology doesn't save you. It just gives you a front row seat to your own nightmare. I was spending a weekend section hiking a remote portion of the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina. I prefer hammock camping because it keeps you off the cold ground, and there's nothing better than falling asleep to the gentle swaying of the trees. By midnight, I had suspended my rain tarp and hammock between 2 large oak trees about 50 yards off the main trail. I wore my high-end Garmin fitness watch to bed, which tracks my sleep cycles, oxygen levels, and uses a proximity feature to sync with my phone's base station in my backpack. The storm rolled in around 1:30 a.m. It wasn't a violent storm, just a steady, rhythmic rain that created a beautiful white noise blanket over the mountains. I drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. Then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., my wrist began to vibrate violently. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I woke up groggy, blinking against the dark. I raised my wrist to look at the glowing screen. It was a high-priority system alert from my fitness app. The screen read, "Multiple accelerometer coupling detected. Are you walking with a partner?" I stared at the screen, my brain trying to process the text. The app thought I was walking next to someone because it was registering 2 distinct physical rhythms. But I was lying perfectly still in a hammock. I dismissed the alert, assuming the wind swaying the trees was glitching the internal sensors. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. 10 minutes later, the watch buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a system alert. It was a heart rate warning. Warning, secondary heart rate detected, 142 beats per minute. My breath caught in my throat. My own heart rate on the screen was sitting at a calm 62 beats per minute. But the watch's optical sensor, which fires a green light against your skin to read your pulse, was picking up a second, incredibly fast heartbeat right next to the device. The green light from the underside of my watch was bleeding through the nylon fabric of the hammock, casting a faint, eerie emerald glow onto the ground underneath me. I slowly, meticulously, rolled my head over to look down at the mesh edge of my hammock. Through the faint green light, I saw something that made my stomach drop into a bottomless void. Standing right underneath my hanging hammock, crouching completely flat on its stomach in the wet mud, was a person. They were positioned perfectly parallel to me, lying directly beneath my body, separated only by the thin layer of canvas fabric. They were holding their arms straight up, their bare, mud-covered palms gently pressing against the underside of my hammock, feeling the weight of my body from below. The secondary heartbeat wasn't a glitch. The watch's sensor was reading the pulse through their bare hands as they pressed against the material right beneath my wrist. I was completely paralyzed. If I made a sudden move, the canvas would shift, and they would know I was looking right at them. Through the thin material, I could hear them whispering. It was a wet, erratic mutter, repeating a sequence of numbers over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were counting my breaths. I looked up at the tarp above me, tears of pure terror welling in my eyes. I needed to get out, but a hammock leaves you completely vulnerable. Your legs are wrapped up, and swinging your feet out takes a few clumsy seconds. Suddenly, the hands beneath me stopped pressing. They gripped the fabric. With a violent, explosive jerk, the person underneath yanked the hammock downward, trying to flip me out onto the muddy ground with them. I screamed as the hammock twisted violently. Instead of fighting the flip, I used the momentum to dive completely out of the open side, crashing hard onto the wet rocks and mud on the opposite side of the trees. I scrambled to my knees and looked back. Rising up from the mud was a man. He was completely emaciated, his skin deathly pale and caked in black dirt, wearing nothing but tattered, ruined jeans. His hair was long and matted, and his eyes were completely hollowed out, staring at me with a feral, predatory hunger. He lunged across the clearing toward me, his fingers clawing at the air. I scrambled backward, found my footing, and sprinted blindly onto the main Appalachian trail. I didn't grab my boots, my phone, or my pack. I ran barefoot over the sharp rocks and jagged roots, the cold mud squishing between my toes as the rain poured down on my face. I could hear him behind me for the first half mile. He was running through the brush parallel to the trail, laughing, a horrible, manic, hyena-like laugh that echoed through the dark ridges. I didn't stop until I hit a paved highway crossing 3 miles later. I stood in the middle of the empty road, shivering and bleeding, until a long-haul trucker spotted me in his headlights and pulled over to pull me into the safety of his cab. The local sheriff's department went up to the campsite the following afternoon. They recovered my backpack, but the hammock had been completely shredded into long, neat strips. The deputy told me they found a hidden cave opening in the rock face, just 50 yards from where I had pitched my camp. Inside the cave were piles of stolen hiking gear, old driver's licenses, and an old battery-operated digital clock. But the detail that still keeps me awake at night, the reason I sold all my gear and will never step foot into the woods again, is what the deputy found written on the cave wall. Using charcoal from an old fire, someone had drawn a massive, crude calendar layout. And in the box for October 24th, the exact night I was sleeping in that hammock, someone had written my full name, followed by the number 3:14 a.m.